Hello, my name is John Stoltz, Director of Conferences and Events for APICS, and I will be your host for today's webinar. We're pleased to be joined by Brian David Johnson, the creator of Threatcasting and Director of the Threatcasting Lab at Arizona State University, providing an introduction to Threatcasting, to learn what Threatcasting is, why you should care about it, and how you can apply it to not only identify future threats, but also prepare for and avoid them as well. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Brian David Johnson.
Thank you very much, John. It is a pleasure to be here today and to talk to everybody about threatcasting and give a very high-level overview. The areas that we'll be touching on today is I'll give a brief introduction of who I am so everybody can get a little better understanding of sort of who I am and my background and how I came to create the threatcasting process. Then we'll jump into a high-level overview of Threatcasting Explained, just some general context around how it's used and where it's used, and some ideas around how it might be different than scenario planning and how it could be used by groups to think about the future of threats and also what to do about them. Then we'll get really detailed. We'll actually get into the process, the process and the framework for threatcasting. Then I thought it would be helpful to give an example of some publicly shared examples of where this has been applied, both in a industry context as well as in a sort of governmental and military context as well over the last few years. Finally, we'll have a little discussion. I'll talk a little bit about how you can apply threatcasting, maybe give some ideas. I would never be so arrogant as to come and assume that I know about your organization or how to specifically apply it, but maybe give you some context around how you might be able to think about applying threatcasting to the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some more information with some links, and also we'll talk a little bit about the events that are coming up if you want to know more about threatcasting. So with that, let's get started. First off, a little bit about myself. As John mentioned at the top of the webinar, my name is Brian David Johnson. I'm the director of Arizona State University's Threatcasting Lab, but also I'm a futurist. I have been a futurist now for about 25 years. And what that means is that I work with organizations who need to make decisions today that may not pay off for 1 year, 5 years, or even 10 years out. I am an engineer and a designer by training, so I'm a very pragmatic futurist. What I do is actually called I'm an applied futurist. So I not only model possible and probable futures, but I also work with organizations to figure out what do they need to do today, tomorrow, 5 years from now to move towards that positive future and move away from those negative futures. And we've created steps along the way to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. And as I give you an overview and we get into the detail of threatcasting, I'll give you a little bit more information about kind of how I do that and how that's done. I like to tell people probably the best example of where I've brought this applied futurism is I was the first in-house futurist. I was the chief futurist at the Intel Corporation, the chip company, the chips that go into servers and go into laptops and all the devices that we use. And the thing about Intel is it took us about 10 years to design, develop, and deploy a chip. And so it was of vital business importance for Intel to know 10 years before what people would want to do, how they would want to act and interact with computers. And that's really what I did, is I used a process called futurecasting. And futurecasting is kind of the basis, and threatcasting is a variant of futurecasting. Used futurecasting to go look out 10 years, look at these disparate inputs and say, okay, here's how people would want to act and interact with this technology, with this chip. And then in the backcasting, we would say, okay, well, what do we need to start doing? What are the investments we need to make? And what are the areas that we need to focus on? In 2016, I stepped down being the chief futurist at the Intel Corporation. I still do quite a lot of work with the company and still am a big fan of theirs. But one of the things that I wanted to do was to start this threatcasting lab at Arizona State University. intimidating. It was not really appropriate to run a threatcasting lab and be the chief futurist at a large publicly traded technology company. So I'm also the futurist in residence, as well as a professor at Arizona State University. And I have a private practice where I work with groups doing this kind of futurecasting and threatcasting work. And just for fun, I'm also the author of some science fiction and science fact, where I actually take the future work that I do, the futures work that I do, and actually apply it to fiction. My last book was a young adult novel called Wizards and Robots, where it was about wizards and robots battling over the centuries, but the robots were based on real robots, and the wizards' magic was actually based on quantum physics. So I try to bring this kind of science fact approach to the science fiction work that I do. So with that, let's dive into threatcasting. Let's really get into what is threatcasting, kind of give you that high-level overview of what it is, and then we'll get into the step-by-step of the process and the framework. So threatcasting at a very, very high level is this conceptual framework where we bring together multidisciplinary people to envision possible scenarios. So generally what that means is we try to bring in, and I try to work with practitioners, where since certainly I can do threatcasting on my own and have, but oftentimes what I do is I'll work with people, work with groups of people who are actually going to go and bring about that future to do that threatcasting. It enables that kind of systematic planning for people to think about these possible threats 10 years out in the future, and then figure out, okay, so what do we need to do? How do we explore the steps that we need to take to change these futures? And a little bit about threatcasting, as I mentioned just previously. So threatcasting is a variant of futurecasting, where futurecasting looks at both positive and negative futures and figures out what organizations need to do to get there, whereas threatcasting really only focuses on the negative. And there's a specific reason for that, because it is a way to bring together groups to take in a lot of information, which we'll get to in a moment, take in a lot of information, model these possible and probable threats, and in that backcast to figure out, okay, what do we need to do? What are the very specific things that an organization can do to disrupt, mitigate, and recover from those threats? And that's really the idea behind threatcasting. It's this continuous multi-step process with inputs from social science, technical research, cultural history, economics, trends. You'll find I'm not a huge fan in exponential curves and sort of the trends that you hear many people talking about. Often the trends that I'm looking at are changes in culture and cultural values and cultural outlook towards things like artificial intelligence, and also trends when it comes to regulation and trends when it comes to kind of government and things like that. So it's not so much your typical kind of Silicon Valley trends, it's more the sort of deeper level changes that are happening both in culture and in government. I also use expert interviews, and then as I mentioned at the top, a little bit of science fiction storytelling, and we'll talk about that, how we use this thing called science fiction prototyping at the core of threatcasting as a way to explore these possible threats. And so these inputs, these broad range of inputs, they inform this exploration of potential visions for the future. And ultimately, as I mentioned, how can we disrupt, mitigate, and recover from these threats? And that's really the core of threatcasting, to bring people together, usually inside of the same organization, people who are actually going to be making change in that organization, and to go through this multi-step process to be able to synthesize from these different inputs, right, social, technical, cultural, economics, come up with these possible threats, and then figure out, okay, as an organization, what do we need to do to disrupt, mitigate, and recover from them? One of the things that many organizations are really interested in is the framework also illustrates what we call flags. And a flag is an event that is outside of the organization's control, but once that flag happens, it will meaningfully affect the threats that we've modeled. Oftentimes, what I tell people is when a flag occurs, that it is an event from which you cannot go back from. And when we get into the detail of the process, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's get into the nitty-gritty details of how do we go about doing this threat casting process. What is the step by step? And so the way that we normally start is we say, okay, here we are in 2018, and we want to move out to 2028, right? We want to look 10 years out. So why do we do 10 years out? That's a very specific determination. The reason why we do 10 years out is it's too far for most people. It's further than most product cycles. It's further than most, the tenure of many C-suites and leadership. It's generally, for many people who are doing this work, it is beyond the tenure of their job. They will usually be doing a different job or changing jobs 10 years out. So I like to tell people that 10 years out is just over the horizon. You can see the light from it. You can see the general direction that we'll be moving in. You can see a range of possible and probable futures, but it also frees groups up, and it frees people up to say 10 years is far enough out that we can really start to imagine threats in a much more broader context. And we use the inputs, which we're going to walk through in a moment. We're going to use these inputs to say, okay, how can these research inputs push us out to that 10-year? So the first research input that we look at is social science. So this is using ethnography, using anthropology to get a deep scientific understanding of what people are going to be like in 10 years. And so the reason we do this is because everything we do is about people. Everything we do in business is about people, but also everything we do when it comes to threat casting is about people. That it starts with people and it ends with people. It has an effect on people. And so we have to have a deep human understanding, a scientific understanding of those people, so that when we start doing this modeling, we have a strong base to pull from. Next, as you can see on the screen, we look at technical research. So what will technically be possible 10 years from now? Now, I'm a technological futurist. As I mentioned, I've spent much of my career in Silicon Valley and working for companies like Intel and many high-tech companies. And what I can tell you is most of the technical information that we need to do this modeling of what will technically be possible, we know. We know what will technically be possible because generally anything that is going to have a mass effect, anything that's going to be in the market in 10 years already exists. It is in some lab somewhere in a university. It is in a lab in a corporation. Typically, there are patents that have already been drafted on it. There are peer-reviewed papers that are being written about it. So from a technical standpoint, we can say, okay, what will technically be possible 10 years from now? And then we can say, well, what effect might that have on the people, on that sort of social side of what's going on? And this is that line of thinking that we're going to continue as we move forward in the threat casting process. Now, the next thing we look at is we look at the cultural history. We look at the cultural history of the organizations that we're modeling for. And as I like to tell people, that cultural history is important because history is the language that we use to talk about the future. History is the on-ramp for the future. Many of the historians that I do work with will tell you that history doesn't repeat itself, but history is the language we use to talk about what's currently going on. So it's really important that we use cultural history because it is the mental model that we're going to use to understand what's coming, especially when it comes to these threats. Another example why cultural history is so important is if you're doing this type of modeling inside of an organization, it's important to know the cultural history of that organization. And what I like to tell people is because there are processes and procedures in place inside of large organizations, and they're there for a good reason. There are org charts, there are planning processes, there are IT rollout plans, there are strategies that are in place. And typically, all of those are in place for good reason, but that reason has everything to do with the past and very little to do with the future. So that as we start to do these threat casting and we start to look 10 years out and see these possible and probable threats, as we start to make change inside of the organization to prepare for them, we need to embrace the idea that there's going to be an inertia that we're pushing against. that the processes and procedures that are in place are generally in place to support what has happened historically, not to support what's going to happen in the future. So as we start to make change as practitioners inside of these organizations and get ready for the future, there will be some pushback. It will be difficult. And as I like to tell many of the groups that I do work with, is if it hurts, that means you're doing it right, and that there's always going to be a little bit of pushback there. And that's why cultural history is important. Now, the next input we use is economics. So again, this is what will the world look like in 10 years? We need to have some basis for that. Now, of course, anybody who has done and work in economics or followed any sort of economic trends, you know that this can change. This can change quite radically from year to year, from decade to decade, but we need to have some baseline. So typically we bring in something that says, okay, this is what the economics of the area that we're looking at, what that could look like in 10 years. Now, the next thing we look at is trends. And I mentioned this before, that I'm not a Silicon Valley exponential curve type trend person. Typically here we're looking at deep changes in cultural opinions, in governmental outlook, in corporate opinions, in things, as I mentioned, like artificial intelligence, like autonomy, because these things will have a large effect on these futures that we're modeling. Now, the next step that we use is we go out and we do interviews with experts, and I like to call this data with an opinion, because threat casting embraces the fact that people build the future, that the future isn't fixed, the future isn't set, that the future is built by people, and more specifically, the future is built by large organizations. And so to understand and get an understanding of what might happen in the future, we have to go and talk to those people. We have to talk to those people who have this very strong opinion. An example I like to use is that if you want to model threats to technology in the future, you should probably go and talk to the large technology companies like Facebook and Google and Intel, because if they have an opinion about the future, it's going to matter. And so getting those opinions is important, because they're going to put their time and their resources to move towards a future that they've envisioned. Additionally, in this area, what I try to do as well is to bring in differing opinions. Try to find people who radically disagree with each other. Because typically what I've found in the work that I've been doing for over the last 2 decades is that usually if you find people who are diametrically opposed to each other, usually neither is 100% right. But what this allows us to do is to map that area and then move towards the middle, to be able to we realize that the answer and the truth probably lies somewhere in between those diametrically opposed opinions. So that becomes really important, to get that kind of grit in the system and get those conflicting arguments, because that's going to become really important. So the final step in this is we use this thing called science fiction prototyping that I mentioned earlier. And science fiction prototyping is central to threat casting, because science fiction prototyping says, how do we take a person in a place experiencing a problem? And that's really what we do to go through and develop these visions for these future threats, is we take all those different inputs from social science, technology, cultural history, economic trends, and data with an opinion. And in the modeling that we do, we take a person in a place experiencing a threat. And this is the one of the core differences of threat casting when you compare it to something like scenario planning, where what we're doing is we're taking a very, very micro approach based upon these wide ranges of inputs. And we're saying we're not going to model all the futures, we're simply going to model a single person in a place experiencing this threat. And what that allows us to do is to get very, very specific, to start at the micro. And ultimately, when we do threat casting in large groups, we actually do this multiple times. We will do multiple models of a person in a place experiencing a threat. That type of modeling is what's called effects-based modeling. You're not modeling the threat itself. You're not even modeling the actual technology. What you're modeling is the effect that it will have. And this comes from what I've learned in the work that I did with Intel and the work that I've done in future casting, where we model services and products. You don't model the service and the product, you model the effect that you want it to have. So similarly here in threat casting, we're not modeling the specific threat up front, we're actually modeling what is the effect it will have, because it will give us a much broader detail on that threat. Because then it allows us to get this vision for 2028 based upon all of these futures, and it gives us these multiple threats. So again, that person in a place experiencing a threat. And as a part of threat casting, we'll actually do that multiple times. We'll create multiple threats and multiple experiences, because that then allows us to backcast. And in the backcasting, we always start first with the event. So the event is the physical or digital instantiation of the threat. Now, the threat could be out there. We could model a threat, but the threat really doesn't come to fruition until it actually affects people. As I mentioned before, it's always about people. It begins and ends. So the event itself is that moment, whether it be digital or physical, where that threat starts to affect people's lives. So then once we've been able to give a lot of detail around that, and that's where the modeling is really, really important, then we can start to say, okay, well, how do we disrupt that event? How do we make sure that that threat never even happens? What steps would we need to take as an organization to say, okay, if we've identified this threat, what are the steps that we would need to take to make sure that it never even happens? Next, we ask ourselves, okay, well, what would happen if we start to identify that the threat is starting to happen, that we're moving towards that event? Maybe it hasn't physically or digitally happened yet, but how then can we start to mitigate it? How can we make sure that we take down the effect that that event would have? And then ultimately, if the event does happen, how do we recover from it? What are the steps we would need to do? What would we need to take as an organization to recover from it? So now in this way, what this has done is not only given us an incredible amount of detail about the threat, it's also given us a wider landscape of actions that the organization could take, whether it be around disruption, mitigation, or even recovery. So it's given us a much broader effects-based model to understand the actions the organization could take. Now, along with that, we also model what are called gates. Now, a gate is an action that the organization can take. So as I mentioned, you've created this effects-based model around disruption, mitigation, and recovery around the event. Well, now the organization can say, okay, well, what are the steps that we could take? What are the investments we could make? What are the research we could start to do? What are maybe some possible partnerships, or possibly some again, direct actions that we could take as a part of an IT plan or a security plan. So these are very specific things that the organization could do inside of that disruption, mitigation, and recovery. And then, as I mentioned at the top, one of the other areas that we start to model, and I found that organizations really, really like this and find that this is really helpful to them, is to say, what are the flags? Again, the flag is an event that once it's occurred, you cannot come back from it. It is outside of your control, but once it happens, you have shown that you are meaningfully moving towards that threat that you have modeled. And so because of that, what we do is we generally find multiple flags. That a flag is not simply one event. Usually we try to identify 4 or 5 different flags. And a flag builds upon the next flag. So it's not all the flags happen at once. So what I mean there is you would have the first event, you would have, let's say, flag A, B, C, and D. And they happen in order. So that if a flag happens for an organization, flag A happens. Well, what that means is usually for the organization, it typically means you don't have to do anything, but it means, okay, this flag has been thrown. This is an indicator that we are moving towards that future. Let's keep watching this area. And then perhaps flag B happens. Flag B then for the organization says, okay, well, we don't need to panic yet, but we really should perhaps convene people together, start coming up with a deeper plan, revisit that disruption, mitigation, recovery detail that we've gotten into so that we can start coming up with a plan. And then let's say flag C happens, and that's usually where you begin to apply money and budget, or you begin to sort of reach out to others. And the whole, again, goal is to keep it in the disruption and mitigation area. So that is really the overview of the threat casting process and the details of the step-by-step. Now, with that said, this is a process. So it is quite linear in the beginning, where you bring in these disparate inputs, you model, come up with a vision for the future, you model these possible and probable threats, then you do the backcasting where you disrupt, mitigate, and recover from them, figure out what your gates and flags are. So when you do this once, it provides you a single output. But where most organizations have found this to be most effective is it's not just a process, but it's a framework. It's a framework for processing multiple inputs, coming up with these broad ranges of threats that are both possible and probable, and then getting very pragmatic. But then as an organization, many have used it as a way to, when there's a new piece of technology, say, or a new piece of economic news, that then they can bring that into the framework, turn the crank again and say, okay, well, does this meaningfully affect the futures and the threats that we've modeled? And oftentimes the answer is no. But for many, this now becomes a way for an organization to have a shared vision of these possible threats and then be able to do something about them and very much to take action with them. Now, in the next area, what I would like to do is just give you a very high level example of where threat casting has been applied. This is all public. This has been talked about in the press. So it is shareable, and at the end of the webinar, there are some links that if you want more information around how this happened and the details of it, and you want to read the reports, you can go there. But I'll give you just a very high-level overview of the threats and what we've done, and then also how multiple organizations, both the United States military as well as a Silicon Valley company, has taken advantage of it. Back in 2016, we did a threat casting at the Army Cyber Institute up at West Point. West Point being the military academy for the United States Army. The Army Cyber Institute is the think tank that is attached to West Point. Their charter for the Army is to avoid strategic surprise on a 5 to 10 year timeline in the world of cyber defense. So we gathered and did a threat casting for them. And looked at the intersection between cybersecurity and the digital supply chain. APICS was an input into this, as certainly the research that APICS has done. And the reason why we wanted to bring those two together is because we saw that the supply chain, the digital supply chain and the physical supply chain, was the moment where the digital and the physical came together. And we brought that together with a cyber attack. The main finding of that threat casting was that as we looked out 10 years in the future, that there was a constellation of technologies, everything from artificial intelligence to autonomy in land, sea, and air, the Internet of Things, smart cities, connected cities, that all of these together were producing, from a cybersecurity standpoint, what we called a widening attack plane. What this meant was saying that this was no longer just a cyber attack, not just a digital attack, that you would begin to see social attacks, you would see attacks on individuals, you would see cyber physical attacks, so starting in the cyber name, but then moving in the physical domain, and then ultimately, the worst case scenarios, you would have cyber kinetic attacks, so very traditional kinetic attacks. And really the big takeaway from this was you would have this widening attack plane, but for the government and for the military, that there was a broad range of things that the government and the military couldn't do, that it was outside of their charter, and actually ethically and legally they couldn't do it. And that in this widening attack plane, that we needed to involve everybody, that we needed to involve not only the government and the military, but we also needed to involve private industry, we needed to involve trade associations and foundations, we needed to involve academia and students and even average citizens, that everybody had a role to play in this widening attack plane. One of the offshoots of this first threat casting was we went and realized that we needed to drill down a little bit further into the weaponization of artificial intelligence. This is a second threat casting that we did in the beginning of 2017, where we brought together that wide range of people. Again, the learning that we took from the widening attack plane, that we needed to bring in this broad cross-section of people. So that is what we did for the New Dogs of War the future of weaponized artificial intelligence. And you'll see down there at the bottom, there's a link to that. Also at the end of the presentation, there'll be a link to both of these reports. And one of the main findings from the artificial intelligence work was we started very specifically thinking about how could people start to apply this artificial intelligence when it comes to surveillance and coercion. So let me take a moment here and give a little bit more detail about this. So the idea here was to say that people would be able to use artificial intelligence to do surveillance, to, at one level, as we would say, watch the attack plane, but be able to surveil wide ranges of people. Whereas in the past, if you wanted to do surveillance on a person, that would be one person or a group of people surveilling another person or another group of people. But what artificial intelligence allowed organizations, whether those be private organizations or state-sponsored organizations or terrorists or hacktivists, that you would be able to have these organizations, and artificial intelligence would allow a much broader means of surveilling, meaning that one individual with the right artificial intelligence could do surveillance on an entire organization, on an entire group, an entire company of people, and use that to be able to find a weakness, whether that be a weakness in somebody, doing something ethically, something unethical, somebody doing something in their personal life, somebody having problems, somebody misstepping, somebody doing something illegal, but basically being able to do surveillance. And then ultimately using that information, once they have found that misstep, to then coerce that single individual, or to use that information to get that person to take action, to get that person to give up information, to get that person to do something that they wouldn't normally do. And that, from a private industry as well as a sort of military and defense contact, was something that we had uncovered in this threat casting that was really quite disturbing, because most people weren't really talking about it and weren't taking actions against it. And that's why we called the report The New Dogs of War. Myself as well, I am, as I mentioned before, I'm a writer, so I am a word nerd. So this is why we brought the quote from William Shakespeare that you see here on the screen, and more specifically at the end of Julius Caesar, where Mark Antony is talking about the effect of Caesar's murder, where he said that effect, essentially it was, he would cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. And many people in their analysis of this had said it's not just about, crying havoc and letting loose using dogs as weapons, but that really what Shakespeare was getting at is that what has happened here with Caesar and Caesar being murdered, that what that was doing was tearing down the very thing that kept us civil. And that's one of the things that we put forward when it came to this use of artificial intelligence, that it was potentially so dangerous that it really could have that same idea, that it really could sort of tear down the bonds of how we're doing business, the bonds of both economic security and global security. And so we then took that, we released these reports, and that was an example of some of the threat casting in some of the areas. So we said we need to do more work to make sure that we're protecting ourselves against this. And where this was then applied is Cisco systems. So Cisco, another Silicon Valley company, had heard about the work that we had been doing with threat casting, hearing what we had talked about in this widening attack plane, certainly looking at the intersection between the digital and the physical when it comes to a supply chain. And their innovation group, which is called CHILL, their innovation group wanted to bring together a group of industry heavyweights, both in Silicon Valley and outside of Silicon Valley, to look at how do we secure the digital supply chain. So they took that information from the widening attack plane that looks at what could happen with the digital supply chain, the digital and physical supply chain, but then also looked at the artificial intelligence and using artificial intelligence to do surveillance, and pulled it together into this science fiction prototype. So this science fiction prototype, as I mentioned before, is science fiction based on science fact. It's a person in place experiencing a problem, and it's one of the outputs that came out of these threat casting, and we used it really as a way to get people's attention. So Cisco brought in, and they wanted to tell this story. So the story is called 2 Days After Tuesday. It is also available on the website at the end, but I wanted to bring it as a very visceral way of explaining these threats. And the idea here is you would have a state-sponsored terror group that wanted to destabilize the United States by attacking critical supply chains. And so our story really begins with the supply chain. So it starts on the edge of the supply chain with a mom and pop store. And this mom and pop supplier, and so we've all seen these kind of small suppliers, and it starts with a phishing attack. So a spear phishing attack where you get a small supplier to be able to click on a link that they shouldn't be clicking onto, which then allows these hackers to have access to this supply chain network using the kind of weakest link on the edge, then allows these attackers to go and start monitoring what's going on inside of this supply chain. And so by doing this surveillance, by using that artificial intelligence to watch multiple points in the supply chain, looking for anomalies, looking for possible vulnerabilities, well, what they uncover is that there's a disgruntled employee, a disgruntled inspector, as you can see here in the upper right-hand area, who they found that there is, in the inspection, in the automated inspection, there's some part that keeps breaking. There's a part that goes down. So there's a vulnerability in the port of Red Hook, New Jersey. And also you have this disgruntled employee who's tweeting about it. Every now and again, just as many people do, going online, just expressing that they've got to work late. So now what these hackers have done is they've exposed, by using artificial intelligence, they've exposed this critical vulnerability in the port. So now what they do is they launch an attack. So this is an attack that they now launch on Tuesday, where they take a highly automated and take a highly digital supply chain, and they launch basically a physical DDoS attack. So the hackers put a little piece of code on refrigerators and digital pantries in Manhattan, basically getting those refrigerators and those pantries to be able to start ordering milk and ordering bananas a few days beforehand. So what this then does is sets the autonomous supply chain into motion, where people start ordering lots and lots of perishable goods. What these perishable goods do, as you see in this middle area, is it starts to clog up the roads because you've got the delivery trucks and the delivery vans going, so you have this increased amount of traffic. What it also does here at the port of Red Hook, New Jersey, which is the main point for Manhattan, where produce comes in, typically bananas, and bananas really have about 5 days to get to market. So you have these autonomous ships being able to clog the ports. So it puts an incredible amount of pressure on the port, which means that the scanners go down, which means that that disgruntled employee now has to go with his colleagues and start to do the inspections, do them manually, and of course they can't inspect all of them. So what this then allows is this terrorist group to be able to sneak in a dirty bomb, which you see down at the bottom. It allows them to kind of get it through Red Hook. Then 2 days after Tuesday, this terror group, of course, is able to bring in that dirty bomb into Manhattan, where they can ignite it, which they do. And then in the final chapter, it shows that it has this incredible destabilizing effect, that chaos reigns. Now, in this very dark, dark future, the whole point of this was to illustrate every step along the way, from that tiny little phishing, that email phishing, through artificial intelligence watching the plane, to the disgruntled employee, to being able to hack into an automated and autonomous supply chain, to then be able to create a physical vulnerability inside of the port, to then be able to create an area where a terrorist cell could bring in a kinetic attack. Now, this very dark future served a purpose, and this is part of really why threat casting is here. This is a quote on screen from Kate O'Keefe. She's the senior director of the Cisco Innovation Lab, and this is why she wanted to do it. She said that people aren't wired to imagine the future 10 or even 5 years out, which is a blocker for her innovation, the work that she wanted to do. So why they wanted to use both threatcasting and this vision for the future is they wanted to create the world for these companies as they were coming together as a prompt, so that they could immerse themselves in this future scenario, making it immediately apparent what solutions needed to be brought together to prepare for this future. So what Ms. O'Keefe did is she used the threatcasting and used the sci-fi prototype as a way to be able to bring these people together and say, okay, we've now shown you from this spear phishing attack on the edge of a digital supply chain and a physical supply chain, all the steps that led to this very awful ending. What could she do? What could Cisco do? What could the gathered companies there do to come up with products, to come up with services to make sure that they were securing the supply chain and they were securing what was happening? And that's what they did. You'll see, as I mentioned in the end, there's more detail on the work of Cisco's Innovation Lab. They ended up coming up with 5 different products and services that they were funded to $250,000 to then take forward and turn into actual businesses. So there's an example of how threatcasting has been used in a very technical way, again, working with the United States military as well as working with a broad collection of both government, military, private industry, trade associations, nonprofits, and academia to find and identify probable and possible threats, to say we need to do more research in this area. We need to make sure that as companies, that as organizations, we're starting to create processes and procedures that can help with this. But then specifically an example of where a company like Cisco was able to take that information and turn it into tools to allow them to make not only their own products safer, but also make a much wider swath of the supply chain and digital supply chain safer. Now, ultimately, how can you apply threatcasting to the work that you do? Realizing that for many, it isn't this broad coalition of people kind of coming together. How can you apply it specifically to your organization? And this, of course, is something that we're going to get into as we start doing the seminars and we dive into it. We won't be able to get into all the detail in today's webinar, but I wanted to kind of give you some ways of thinking about it as you're doing your planning, as you're thinking about these possible threats. And the first step is to do it. To actually give yourself the time to think about these threats. That's what I tell most people. As a futurist, it's my job to look 10 years out and think about these threats and make organizations and people more safe. But oftentimes people don't give themselves the platform and the time to do it. So even if you aren't bringing together a broad group of people, even if you or even your small group has the ability to do this, is to take the time to think about it. And what threatcasting can do is really just give you a framework to start pulling in information to say, okay, for your specific area, for what you do, for what your organization does, let's find some social science. Let's talk about the people who you're affecting. It could be your customers, it could be the people in the network, it could be the people that you're working with, but get an understanding of those people. Next, start thinking about what are the technologies that are going to affect and allow these threats to happen. What could happen with these technologies? And that could simply be a search on the internet. We all hear the different technologies that are out there, but being able to use that as a way so that you're looking for, okay, well, what are the technologies that might affect these threats in these areas? Next, to actually start looking at the cultural history. Look at the cultural history of your organization to say, okay, if we're going to make change inside of our organization or some broader group of people, do we understand how they're set up? And then do we understand if and when we start identifying these threats, what changes we would need to make? Again, to look at the economics. What will the world look like? What will your market, what will your business, your area, your sector, what will it look like in 10 years? Next, what's changing? What are the trends that are changing? What could change inside of governments and regulations? What could change inside of local governments as well? And what is changing inside of public opinion? And then I often push people that, threatcasting, although you can do it by yourself, is often not done in a vacuum. So who inside of your broader network could help? Who inside of your customers, who's inside of the people that you're working with? It often pushes people to think of their ecosystem in a very different way, in a much broader way. And then I would say, take all of those inputs and start thinking about, all right, let's think about a person in a place experiencing this threat based upon all those inputs. And think about kind of multiple areas in there. And then do your own backcasting. Okay, figure out what would the disruption, mitigation, and recovery look like as you start to do that. So really, this is that framework to be able to go and search for all those different pieces of information, to then give yourself the time to think about what these possible threat features could be. And then once you've done it, really over that 10-year time frame, give yourself that longer landing strip, if you will, to be able to think about it and figure out, all right, well, what are the actions that I could take? What is the actions that your organization can take to disrupt, mitigate, and recover? But then also, what are the things that could happen? What are the things you need to keep an eye out for with the flags? What do you need to be watching for? And if it happens, what actions would you take? Or if it doesn't happen, to figure out why. So that's really, I think, at a very high level, how you can apply threat casting in really in any process, especially as you're starting to think about these threats, is that framework for processing multiple inputs, and then that framework in the backcasting to take action. So now, as we begin to wrap up, I wanted to make sure to put out there more information. As I mentioned throughout the webinar, there are multiple places that you can go to get more information about threat casting, to get more information about the specifics of it. As right here on this page, you see is the coin and the saying for the threat casting lab at Arizona State University, that it's really our charter and our goal to envision futures that empower action. That's really the whole goal of threat casting in general. So if you want more interest from a very high level about threat casting, you can go to the Threat Casting Lab website. There you will find the publications of the lab. You will also find a fair amount of media that has been given where people have talked about the lab and the application and where they have used it. Everything from, as I mentioned before, the work that Cisco had done and the work that was done by the United States military, but also there's some examples from the United States Bar Association and some other places where people have actually applied it. And then as an overview, I thought if you wanted to just get a high level overview of what the heck is threat casting, there was an article that I wrote with a faculty member from West Point, Lieutenant Colonel Venata. She and I authored a very high level, very approachable article for Slate, the online magazine called What the Heck is Threat Casting? And in that, it'll give you a little bit more detail, not on the academic level that you would see in the threat casting lab, but I figure if you wanted to be able to just see what it might be like or share it with other people, that's pretty much a good place to start. And it also has a little bit more information around the work that we had done with Cisco. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And I think what we can do is we will open it up to see if there are any questions.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Just absolutely fascinating content. And yeah, I'm listening to this and thinking, 2 days after Tuesday, and I'm just still processing that, right? I mean, it's extraordinary to think how such simple steps can create such potentially horrific outcomes. So very eye-opening, and thank you for sharing that. We have saved a few minutes of time for some questions, and so I will just put out there. Let me start with. How is threat casting different than, say, more traditional scenario planning?
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit, and it's a good point to make. So scenario planning, for those who know, or maybe those who don't, right? Scenario planning is typically trying to figure out from a very high level what could happen, and usually it's broken into kind of 4 different areas where you take an XY axis of a couple different trends that might happen. And then what's plotted to say, okay, well, what if trend 1 does happen and trend 2 doesn't happen, what's the scenario? And if trend 2 happens, but trend 1 doesn't happen, what's the scenario? Or if they both happen, what's the scenario? Or if then neither of them happen. So it's that 4 approach, and it's a very, very high level, very effective. And oftentimes, though, what I had found, and one of the impetus for developing threat casting was that type of thinking is necessary, certainly, but not sufficient. Where the amount of detail that is generally taken from scenario planning is very, very high. Again, it's what if, and kind of getting kind of high level prepared, where that starts at the macro, at high level trends, and then kind of thinks about what would the organization do about it. Whereas threat casting is really the exact opposite. Threat casting starts at the micro. Remember I mentioned it's based upon all those high level inputs. It's about a person and a place experiencing a threat. So it starts at a very, very small level, at that micro level, and we do it multiple times, where we think of multiple people in multiple places experiencing that threat. And so then it allows us in the aggregate to be able to say, okay, well, what does that mean at a higher level? And what many practitioners will tell you is it gives a far higher level of detail. It gives much better clarity in what steps an organization could take. Again, as you're really starting to think about disruption, mitigation, and recovery, it allows you to really get specific around what actions you should take and what things you should look for. So in my world as a futurist, I think they're both very valid and they're both very used, but threat casting was really designed to really be that that practitioner and pragmatic way of diving into it, so that you can figure out what actions to take.
Perfect. Very, very helpful clarity on that. Next up, I think it's fairly obvious to think of the role this exercise has, certainly in these kind of military or national security implications. But are there other applications, maybe in a non-military context, or how would other organizations look to do this similar type of initiative?
Definitely, and and part of the reason why is you can understand that many of the examples that I've done for this, and especially over the last decade when I have done this with organizations, this remains secret. It remains confidential, because many people, certainly when they're doing this, it remains inside of their company's intellectual property, as it should. The wonderful thing about the United States government is they've been very good around wanting to release this, to talk about it, and also that's why I've been very fortunate with the folks at Cisco. They have been very vocal and very open about it, so I feel very fortunate there. What I can tell you is that the majority of threat casting that I have done, and that it is done, is actually done by private industry. As you can see, it becomes an input to two different areas. One, it can become an input to the long-term strategic plan of a company, to be able to look at what are the threats to the company, what are the threats to your business lines, what are your threats to your areas. So it really allows for this broad range, comprehensive way of searching that 10-year out future for possible threats to the organization, and then also what the organization then might do to disrupt, mitigate, and recover. And oftentimes that could be mergers and acquisitions. Oftentimes that is intellectual property, being able to get patents in certain areas. Sometimes it's identifying possible partners that the organization hadn't done work with before. So there's really some really good areas where it can be an input to the long-term strategic planning for the company itself. So that's one area. And then another area where more increasingly people are using it more and more is in this area that usually comes under IT or the chief security officers of companies, where they will use this to look at not only just threats to the company, but also maybe threats to the business line or threats to the market in general. And I can tell you just recently that MasterCard has gone public talking about some of the threat casting work that we've been doing with them, as they've been thinking about payment systems, as they've been thinking about their broader ecosystem. They're really using it as a way to really search those possible threats that really that they need to keep an eye on, to make sure certainly that it not only is good for their business, but also it's good in a way of protecting their money and certainly the national and global economy. So there's multiple places, I think, and especially for industry and sort of non-governmental, non-military folks, that it's very applicable.
Great, thanks, Brian. One final question to put out. I'm curious, again, so you've been working in this space for some period of time. Given what we're seeing happen with artificial intelligence and new resources and data processing capabilities, has that changed this process? Has it accelerated it, or how do those pieces fit together?
It has created a much greater need for it, to be quite honest. As we've begun to see, as we've moved from the 20th century into the 21st century, we have been seeing, again, this constellation of technologies, of artificial intelligence, certainly, and machine learning, that is really transforming business, it's transforming security, it's transforming policing and medicine, it's certainly transforming and will transform supply chains. But add with that autonomy in land, sea, and air, so the ability, not only just self-driving cars, but ships and drones as well. And add to that the Internet of Things and smart cities. So all those areas that kind of go into that widening attack lane that I mentioned in the Army Cyber Institute report. But I think for private industry, people are really beginning to see that it's not just one technology. It's when all of these technologies are layered on top of each other that the complexity becomes such that people were really looking for some framework to process that complexity, to understand, okay, when you have all these different technologies coming together, and certainly they're coming at a very fast rate, how do we prepare? As an organization, how do we prepare? As a business, how do we prepare? And I think for many, threatcasting is a very important tool in that area, that it helps people in a very methodical way pull together information, in a very transparent way as well, pull together information, create these possible threats and these possible futures, and then start to take action. It empowers them to start as an organization, figuring out what investments and what they need to do. Now, certainly threatcasting isn't the pill to solve all ills. That's not it at all. But I'm seeing more and more that because of that complexity, the complexity of all those technologies, and a lot of the complexities in global markets, the complexities in the kind of changing of culture and the shifting of business landscapes, that it's a very, very methodical way for people to comprehend it, to write it down, and then to take action, and then to be able to grade it, to be able to look as they take action 3 months from now, 6 months from now, to keep going back to the model, to keep going back to what they threatcasted and make sure that they're on the right path. So I think for many, it's that increasing complexity that threatcasting really gives them and empowers them to take action.
Excellent. Brian, thank you again for your time, and thanks to all of our participants for being on today's webinar. Extraordinary insights. If you're interested in learning more information in regards to threatcasting, we do have 2 seminar events scheduled in 2019 that will provide a very deep dive. Those are scheduled for April 23rd, 2019 in Chicago, and September 15th, 2019 in Las Vegas. So I'd invite you to visit apics.org/events to learn more and to register, and we do hope to see you there for that. Clearly, this is a topic that's highly relevant to our community, and we think it's an exceptional resource for folks going forward. This concludes today's APICS online event. Thanks again for participating. All content and materials included in this APICS online event are the property of APICS and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.